Pacific greetings, everyone. I am glad you have rejoined the training on human rights in nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. Welcome to Module 2 on applying human rights and JETSI to nature-based solutions projects. My name is Marioni. Building upon Module 1, which focused on the relationship between human rights and nature-based solutions, Module 2 focuses on identifying and mitigating risks to 12 human rights that might result from nature-based solutions. Remembering that human rights cannot be attained without environmental safeguards in place for biodiversity and natural systems. Conversely, biodiversity and natural systems cannot be protected or well managed without the right social safeguards to protect people's human rights. The following topics are explored as part of this module. Understanding what is a human rights risk assessment for nature-based solutions projects. How to conduct a human rights risk assessment. And how risk assessments inform and contribute to an environmental and social management system. At the end of this presentation, we hope that you will know why risk assessments improve the design and implementation of nature-based solutions projects and be able to conduct your own human rights risk assessments of nature-based solutions. The presentation structure starts off with a look at conducting a risk assessment, then an activity-based introduction to applying a human rights risk assessment tool. The presentation then concludes with a brief linking to environmental and social management systems. The first topic looks at conducting a risk assessment. We'll cover firstly why consider conducting a risk assessment, and then we'll look at identifying entry points in a project to undertake a human rights risk assessment. Our first section looks at conducting a risk assessment. Why conduct a risk assessment? Activities and projects related to nature-based solutions can have both positive and/or negative impacts on human rights. Unwanted negative impacts may occur when nature-based solutions are implemented. Risk assessments are particularly important because the pursuit of one right might have a negative effect on another right. Nature-based solutions practitioners should conduct a human rights risk assessment to ensure such situations are considered when designing and implementing nature-based solutions projects, and their considerations of how such situations can be mitigated should also be considered in a risk assessment. Risk assessments are often integrated into environmental and social management systems to ensure environmental and social safeguards are built into projects. Considering entry points for human rights risk assessment. It is not possible to identify every possible risk before a project starts, as nature-based solutions are place-specific, and the environment and social risks are also place-specific. This is why detailed risk assessments are usually conducted at the beginning of a project, in the early stages of implementation, to identify these with different stakeholders, what the specific risks are of the project, and potential actions to take to prevent or mitigate such risks. Risk assessments are often integrated into environmental and social management systems to ensure environmental and social safeguards are built into projects and monitored throughout the project life. Conducting a human rights risk assessment can be done using the following methods or tools. A risk assessment question guide to assist nature-based practitioners to determine with stakeholders the potential risks to Pacific human rights by the proposed project and identify ways to minimize those risks. This activity can be applied through focus group discussions within the community, with NbS practitioners facilitating discussions in a gender and social inclusion sensitive way from the question guide. Second tool, resource mapping with community members, including people who may be marginalized, where there is potential for the project to impact or restrict use or access to any natural resources. Mapping tools used in Pacific communities for similar activities include Live and Learns, a facilitator's guide to gender inclusive natural resource management. A JETSI analysis of the project community, including a minimum of basic profile of the community with sex desegregated data. A basic JETSI analysis of the community can be conducted using available tools such as the Pacific Handbook on Gender Equality and Social Inclusion in Coastal Fisheries and Aquaculture from SPC, and WCS's Gender Equity and Social Inclusion Analysis for Coastal Fisheries. Effective risk management requires close cooperation with communities. Practitioners can use the risk assessment tool to establish guidelines and facilitate discussions with communities on risks to human rights and solutions. This facilitation also includes the collection and processing of information that informs the risk assessment process and forms the basis for discussions among stakeholders. Sources of information are numerous and vary from nature-based solution to nature-based solution. Practitioners can start with desk research to establish preliminary understanding of the context, and then conduct interviews with the community, both individual interviews and or focus group discussions, to map risks and understand the differences between groups in the community, determine capacities to manage risks, and strategize together with the community on actions to reduce or minimize risks. Interviews with diverse members of communities will provide important information about accessing the capacity of women and men to manage risk. And important efforts should be made to desegregate the collection and processing of sex desegregated data to support the risk assessment process and the design of risk management strategies. The following section will focus on using a human rights risk assessment tool to identify how nature-based solutions projects may impact on human rights and consider actions to minimize or avoid such impacts. The exercise features a case study of a forest conservation project in the Pacific. The risk assessment tool will screen the project using various questions centered on 12 human rights, as presented in Module 1, to determine A, the types of rights which are impacted negatively, B, the groups in community at risk, C, their risk management practices, roles and constraints, and D, what kinds of actions can be taken by the project to avoid or minimize negative impacts to rights. Let's remember that nature-based solutions practitioners should co-design with communities practical risk management measures that will contribute to protecting and promoting their rights. Early consultations with communities will enhance ownership of the process and facilitate incorporation of the recommendations into nature-based solutions plans. Activity 1. The case study looks at setting up the Cow Reserve, a forest conservation project in the Pacific. Conducting a human rights risk assessment of the Cow Reserve project using the following questions as a guide to assess how rights are impacted. The risk assessment tool presented over the next couple of slides will screen the project using various questions centered on human rights to determine the types of rights which are impacted negatively, the groups in the community at risk and their risk management practices, roles and constraints, and what kinds of actions can be taken by the project to avoid or minimize negative impacts. The activity case presented in this example. High biodiversity forests in the Cow watershed are being harvested for their high-value timber as well as to clear land for agriculture. Some farmers have cleared forests along the edge of the river and the riverbanks have become unstable. These activities on the land are causing an increase in erosion that is resulting in sedimentation of rivers, which is affecting coral reefs downstream. The women are often complaining that they have to travel further to collect clean water that is safe for drinking and for washing their clothes. During the rainy season, a number of villages in the watershed experience flooding, and sometimes there are landslides. The villagers living on the coast complain frequently to government officials that their reefs are getting covered in sediment and are starting to die, and this is affecting their ability to fish. Some of the elders from Cow Village are concerned and have met with the Ministry of Forestry to help them. They were interested in setting up a large forest reserve to protect the remaining forests before it is too late. Following is the proposed project with the ministry. The proposal identified 3 large areas of forest for protection that are situated at the top of the watersheds. In the past, the village had traditional closures, tamboos, over their forests, but this practice has not been used for 10 years. The elders are interested in reviving this traditional practice as they have worried that the youth are starting to forget their culture and traditions. There is also funds to train 2 forest wardens from the community. It is important to note that while there are 5 clans in the village, the land being proposed for protection is owned by 3 clans in the village. Begin to consider what the risks are and how would you mitigate and manage those risks. Let's recall that when conducting a risk assessment, using a human rights focused checklist can help ensure that the assessment team collects the information it needs to incorporate human rights from the start. The questions below are for illustrative purposes and may vary from nature-based solutions to nature-based solutions, depending on the circumstances, context, and required depth of the risk assessment in question, but should generally be guided by overarching questions like what constraints limit men and women and other marginalized groups' full involvement along all parts of the proposed project in question? What groups within the communities are affected by the nature-based solutions, and what are the differences in capacity between groups in the community to manage such risks? What kinds of actions can be taken to minimize the negative impacts determined in the assessment? The following top human rights to consider and associated questions should be used to help identify key risks and actions or strategies to prevent or mitigate risks in the cow community. Rights to non-discrimination and gender equality. Non-discrimination and equality recognizes that every human being is entitled to all rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, language, sex, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. For the Cow Reserve project, assess the risks with the following questions. Who will be impacted by the project? How and are there some groups that will be impacted more than others? Has a stakeholder analysis identified potential at-risk groups for the project? What actions will be taken to protect those most at risk? Will the approaches used to engage stakeholders favor some groups more than others? How are the benefits of the project distributed between different stakeholders, and is it fair and just? Are there differences between men and women or any other group with respect to the ability to access and use information? Some examples of positive impacts that may arise or be identified through the Cow Reserve Project assessment include that all members of the village benefit from the forest reserve, reduces this soil erosion, flooding and sediment in the rivers, or that Cow Village as well as those downstream have access to clean water. Some examples of negative impacts that may arise from the assessment include risks of excluding women and persons living with disability from consultations about the plans to create the reserve. Women and girls who forage the forest area for herbal medicines and firewood may no longer have access to the forest. Risks to the livelihoods of those who depend on the forest for natural resources were the forest to become fully enclosed or restricted. Some examples of potential actions to mitigate such risks include using community and stakeholder engagement techniques that are gender sensitive and inclusive, with particular attention to those that are marginalized. Ensure practitioners understand the root causes of prejudice and discrimination within the community and know how to take effective measures against the underlying conditions that cause or help to perpetuate these. Develop a gender action plan so that specific and deliberate activities targeting women and other marginalized groups in the cow community and the removal of gender barriers in a cultural sensitive way is incorporated in the project plans. Next is to consider the rights of persons with disabilities. Those living with disabilities are some of the most marginalized in our communities, and they face numerous barriers, including when it comes to contributing to nature-based solutions and climate change adaptation projects. The following are examples of questions that would help assess the risks of the Cow Reserve project. Consider, does the nature-based solutions projects and specifically project activities consider the voices, rights, and needs of those living with disabilities within the cow community? Are those living with disabilities part of the decision-making process of the project? Are the benefits of the nature-based solutions reaching persons with disabilities in all the communities? What barriers exist for persons living with disabilities to engage the nature-based solutions project and the benefits of the proposed projects? Will the nature-based solutions build resilience of persons with disabilities? For the Cow Reserve, some impacts may include positive impacts as access to clean water and food, reduction in soil erosion and flooding. Negative impacts may be that the reserve may limit access to traditional medicines and access to livelihood resources. Potential actions to consider. Again, use a community and stakeholder engagement techniques that are gender and social inclusive, with particular attention to those that are marginalized. Ensure persons with disability from the community are consulted and were able to participate in committee deliberations on the project, secure alternative sites for accessing traditional medicines, ensure projects are specific and have activities to engage persons living with disabilities. Next is to consider the rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. A safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is needed in order to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. For the Cow Reserve project, assess the following. Who will benefit from the project's proposed nature-based solution and the healthy environment anticipated, and is this fair and equitably done? If any infrastructure or works are planned, what are the environmental risks and what social safeguards will be put in place? Does everyone have equal access to information about the proposed nature-based solutions project? To make decisions concerning the impacts of the project? If there is an environmental committee, who is represented on these committees? How are they appointed? Do the committees function in a way that promotes inclusive and just practices? Do communities have access to the justice system to address violations of environmental rights? For the Cow Reserve, some impacts may include: positively, all clans in the village and communities downstream will benefit from clean water, reduced sediments in the river and coastal area, reduced soil erosion and flooding. Future generations will have access to healthy forests. Some negative impacts that may arise: only 3 clans of the 5 clans will determine the reserve conditions and control its use and access, and will have to give up extractive use of the forest. Some groups may be excluded from the reserve benefits if there is any income generated in the future, for example, conservation, lease, and tourism. Intensification of forest use in other parts of the watershed. Some potential actions that may be taken up. For any infrastructure or work plans, consider the need for an environmental impact assessment. Ensure women, youth, and other community groups are included in environmental committees. Carefully assess who are the beneficiaries of nature-based solutions and if they are fair and equitable. Consider the right to clean water. Nature-based solutions should protect and support people's right to sufficient, safe, clean, physically accessible water to meet their personal and domestic needs. For the Cow Reserve, assess whether any of the negative nature-based solutions impacts the rights of water, water quality, and access to water. Who will benefit from water-related nature-based solutions? Do water interventions include infrastructure investments? Consider also the right to healthy food. Nature-based solutions must ensure food availability is continued or enhanced, and this includes food available from natural resources for fishing, hunting, and gathering, or for food production systems. For the Cow Reserve, consider whether the nature-based solutions impact directly or indirectly on the nutritional food security of individuals or communities. Who will benefit from food-related nature-based solutions? Some examples of impacts that may arise through the Cow Reserve. Positively, clean water downstream as there is less soil erosion. An increase in reef health and access to fish closer to coastal community. Reduced soil erosion and flooding. Negative impacts may include intensification of forest use in parts of the watershed, impacting water quality in other river systems. Also, clans have rights to the forest may not be able to access the forest for food, including ones that are resistant to cyclone damage. Potential actions may include ensuring nature-based solutions contributes to the protection and maintenance of clean water sources and addresses issues of displacement of forest use. Carefully assess who are the beneficiaries of nature-based solutions and if they are fair and equitable. Ensure actions are taken to prevent impacts to nutritional food security. Now let's consider the rights to adequate shelter, housing, and secure tenure. The right to adequate housing should not be interpreted narrowly as only the physical home. Rather, it should be seen as the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity. When designing and implementing nature-based solutions, this means considering people's land tenure rights as well as their rights to access natural resources for shelter and housing. In our activity, we also consider and recognize the rights of indigenous peoples to own, possess, manage, and use ancestral lands and natural resources. Nature-based solutions must not lead to forced evictions of people from their land. For the Cow Reserve project, assess the following. Will there be loss of tenure rights and access to natural resources? Which individuals and groups will be affected? Do women and men have different rights with respect to how land is used or owned? Will individuals or groups be displaced? Do tenure rights have a bearing on the types of activities the cow project might need to include to ensure equitable distribution of benefits? The following are some examples of impacts of the Cow Reserve project that may arise. Positive impacts include reinforces the right to make decisions on their land, reinvigorates traditional practices such as closures, taboos, as examples for youth. Some negative impacts may be that the community is unable to access forests for traditional foods and medicines, reduced opportunity for income generating activities. Potential actions that may help mitigate risks. Nature-based solutions should assess forest timber needs and uses of communities for shelter and homes. If there is any displacement of people or loss of rights, there is needs to be free, prior and informed consent. And compensation measures need to be taken into consideration. Any loss of tenure rights should consider the impact to both current and future generations. Consider the right to health. The right to health is an inclusive right that extends not only to healthcare, but also to the factors that determine good health, including access to safe drinking water and adequate sanitation, a sufficient supply of safe food, nutrition, and housing, healthy occupation and environmental conditions, and access to health-related education and information. For the Cow Reserve project, consider how does the nature-based solutions benefit all the different dimensions of health and well-being of community members? Will the nature-based solution impact the health and well-being of individuals or communities? For the Cow Reserve, some impacts that may arise include positive impacts such as support access to clean and safe water, food, and healthy environment brought on by the Cow Reserve project. Negative impacts, and depending on the rules, there may be reduced or no access to traditional foods and medicine from the forest due to the project. Potential actions to take to mitigate risks. Ensure that there are specific strategies to improve human well-being. Potentially allow for access to traditional medicines provided it does not impact overall health of forest. Let's consider rights to and at work. NbS projects should consider if interventions being proposed will limit or alter individuals or groups of individuals, examples foresters and farmers. their rights to earn a living, including from nature-based livelihoods. For the cow reserve, consider the following. Are there differences in the community in terms of the types of work and opportunities for work? Will the nature-based solutions proposed result in a loss or decline in livelihoods? Will those doing environmental work, example, defenders, committee members, patrol teams, etc., be at risk? For our cow reserve, some impacts that may arise from the project include the creation of work for 2 appointed wardens, or negative impacts that include the restriction on access to forest materials for livelihoods and violence towards forest wardens for enforcing the rules. Potential actions to take: inclusive and participatory decision making, particularly with those most at risk. Consider what actions can be taken to reduce the impact on local livelihoods and, where possible, design alternative sources and support. Ensure measures are in place to protect those doing risky work. Let's consider rights to inclusive, participatory, and democratic governance. Participatory, equitable, transparent, and accountable governance of nature-based solutions means using approaches that ensure all relevant stakeholders have the opportunity to engage and effectively participate in all matters and decisions that would affect their rights, especially those that might be marginalized. For the Cow Reserve project, assess: are the voices, opinions, and suggestions of other marginalized groups such as youth or those living with disabilities integrated in decision-making concerning the project? Is there a risk that decision-making will be based on limited, narrow perspectives which could lead to increased social or economic inequalities amongst the members of the cow community? Are there differences between groups with respect to authority and decision-making within the community? Are women and men represented equally in local committees and decision-making bodies? Are there any barriers that might limit the ability of a certain group in the community to provide inputs into the design and subsequent implementation of the Cow Reserve project? Some impacts that may be arising from the cow project include: the project promotes positive working relationships with the land-owning community and local government through wide consultation practices and whole-of-community decision-making processes. Negative impacts may include: the project risks limiting decision-making and consultation with representatives of only the 3 land-owning clans, excluding marginalized groups from the village in decision-making. Potential actions to take to reduce risks: ensure active, inclusive, and transparent participation of the diversity of stakeholders in the community. Invest in removing barriers to equitable and inclusive participation in decision-making within your project. Ensure staff and partners have training on inclusive facilitation techniques and decision-making processes. The rights of Indigenous peoples. Nature-Based Solutions Project must consider the rights of Indigenous and other traditional communities and take action or put in place social safeguards to respect and protect their rights to the lands, waters, territories, and resources that they have traditionally owned, occupied, and used. For the Cow Reserve project, assess for the following. Will there be a weakening or erosion of Indigenous governance structures, processes, and rights through the project implementation? Will there be any weakening of tenure rights over land and or water? Will there be any relocation of Indigenous people or traditional communities? If there is relocation, Will any compensations to Indigenous communities be just and fair, and will they have the option of return? Will Indigenous knowledge systems be valued or be weakened or ignored? How will the Nature-Based Solutions project protect and respect the knowledge and practices of Indigenous peoples and local communities in relation to the conservation and sustainable use of their lands, territories, and resources? Will there be any impact, restriction, or loss of cultural rights, including cultural practice? Will any cultural practice be criminalized? For the Cull Reserve, some impacts may include traditional leaders identified and raised the issue and leading the implementation of the project. The Cull Reserve project promotes traditional and cultural knowledge processes of conservation. Some negative impacts may include the rights to use and access the materials in the forest become restricted. Some potential actions to undertake to mitigate risks include the inclusion of different knowledge systems and participation of affected groups. They include Indigenous people, local communities, women and youth in the project's decision-making processes, conduct FPIC, and establish grievance mechanisms within the project. Let's consider the rights to live free of conflict and violence. Nature-based solutions projects should support a safe and enabling environment in which individuals and groups that work on nature-based solutions interventions can operate free from threats, harassment, intimidation, and violence. For the Cow Reserve project risk assessment, consider the following questions. Will the nature-based solutions cause conflict or widen existing conflicts within or between communities? Will monitoring, compliance, and enforcement activities be done without violence? Will perpetrators of environmental crimes be treated with respect and have access to judicial systems? For the Cow Reserve, the following are some examples of impacts that may arise. Positive impacts include that the project may increase access to water, food, clean, safe and healthy environment which reduces conflicts over resource scarcity. Negative impacts may include conflicts that arise as wardens enforce the rules of the reserve. Forest wardens could be at risk from physical harm or might inflict physical harm. Examples of potential actions to reduce or mitigate such risks. Ensure grievance mechanisms are in place to address issues as they arise. Ensure monitoring, patrols, and enforcement systems have procedures in place to protect the rights of those undertaking the work, as well as those encountered in the field, including those that are breaking the rules. Intergenerational rights, equity, and justice. Nature-based solutions interventions must place a greater emphasis on long-term benefits for future generations and account for the costs and trade-offs that likely impinge on or violate the rights of future generations to a healthy environment. For the Cow Reserve project, assess the following. How will the nature-based solutions impact the current and future generations? Will any nature-based solutions remove or diminish the rights of the current or future generations? For the Cow Reserve project, some impacts may include positive impacts of the project could be that forests exist for future generations, sharing traditional and cultural knowledge through the project on conservation with the youth, Some negative impacts may include youth cannot use the forest resources due to the project and have to seek alternatives in the short term. Potential actions to mitigate such risks: engage the youth to ensure their viewpoints and needs and aspirations for their future are considered. Activity 2. Applying this tool to your project. The following activity is focused on applying the same tool that we've just used above for the Cow Reserve project to a specific nature-based solutions project you were working on. In Module 1, Activity 2, you were asked at the end of the training to consider a nature-based solutions project you are working on or have been part of and map how human rights were being enhanced or supported through that project, as well as identify which of the 12 rights are at risk due to the project implementation and impacts. Now, bring here the same project example you used in Module 1, Activity 2, and your initial analysis of impacts to human rights. Consider in this activity how your approach to the community will be done to source information needed to assess risks. Consider using the risk assessment questions in the previous activities and how to apply those questions to the rights identified as being at risk due to the implementation of the project. Finally, in this activity, how may the risks be mitigated and minimized through the project? The final section of this presentation is a brief look at human rights risk assessment in relation to environmental and social management systems. What is an ESMS and how are human rights linked to ESMS? An environmental and social management system provides a methodological approach for organizations to manage environmental and social risks and impacts in a structured way on an ongoing basis. It is a term used by development organizations and agencies to refer to policies, standards, and operational procedures designed to identify, avoid, mitigate, and minimize adverse environmental and social impacts. It is designed to ensure projects comply with environmental and social policies and standards of project organizations and stakeholders. ESMS support identifying risks to, as well as opportunities to strengthen environmental and social standards. A human rights risk assessment is a part of ESMS and should be conducted at the earliest stages of the project design and monitored and evaluated throughout the project cycle. ESMS are generally guided by principles and specific safeguards that link to and are founded on the realizations of specific human rights and environmental goals. This includes the principle of protecting, respecting, and promoting human rights, gender equality, climate change. Thank you for joining this presentation on learning about human rights risk assessment for nature-based solutions.